Hello, I'm Gavin Rees and I work for Dart Centre. I'm delighted that you can join us here in Sheffield DocFest's very own corner of Zoomlandia for this really important discussion. We're holding it at a moment when the world is being rocked by two big crises simultaneously. The first is the world itself. So we have the growth of populism, environmental change, fresh attempts to tackle systematic racism. It's getting hot out there. There's a lot going on. And the second is a crisis within the industry. And that's a crisis caused principally now by COVID-19. And so many of us as filmmakers or people working with film are in situations where projects have been shelved and living in this kind of strange world of suspended animation. The title of our session is Filmmakers and Contributors' Mental Health. How can we do better? And when we're talking about mental health in this context, we're principally going to be talking about the strains of working around issues to do with trauma. How do we respond appropriately to vulnerable people? How do we capture their stories? And also how we look after our own mental health. Before we go into more detail on that, I would like to introduce our panel. So first of all, we have Alyx Ayn. She's based in the Philippines. Please wave, say hi, thank you. She's an experienced current affairs producer who's made a wonderful film that's in the festival here called Aswang, which has found a new language, a new way of describing the appalling tragedy that's befallen her home country, the Philippines, and discusses Duterte's so-called war on drugs. The film documents a group of individuals who call themselves the Nightcrawlers, who are a mixture of human rights activists, journalists, and others committed to documenting extraditional killings in the country. David DeHaney is a multi-award winning filmmaker, thank you for waiting, who has also a very long distinguished record of making sensitive films on tough subjects in ways that expand audiences. David is creative director of Proper Content, which is a perfect name for a film company. I can't think of a few better. Recently, he's made a number of kind of must-see series. There's a school that tried to end racism for Channel 4 and Suicidal in Our Own Words for Channel 5. Rachel Hillman is the director of grants and programs at the Film+TV Charity. Last year, they produced a groundbreaking report on mental health in the television and entertainment industries. More recently, she's been going flat out, trying to support journalists and support filmmakers rather, during this time of COVID-19. Sasha Mertoff is a man of many hats, please wave. Sasha is currently head of Channel 4 Bristol. He's also a trustee of the Dart Centre, so he's on our board. And he's another filmmaker with a distinguished record of working on filmmaking projects that demand kind of sensitive approaches and treatments. You may have seen Protecting Our Children, which is a series that looks at children in the care system, or more recently, Drugland. He also has had the opportunity to work with David Attenborough and has made a film about lions. So I'll try and deal with my jealousy in my own time. So first of all, before we get into the discussion itself, some quick house rules. We're going to be talking about trauma, and there's a subject that can bring up lots of issues. It can bring up distress for any of us who've worked on those kinds of projects in the past. So I urge you to pace yourselves. If you see something distressing in a clip, please feel free to look away. Some of the material we're going to be showing is pretty strong, so you've been warned. Secondly, we want to make this as interactive as possible. And now that's a limit with Zoomlandia, but if you can put any questions that you have using the Q&A function, so that's the Q&A function, not the chat function, and we'll try and get to them wherever we can. There'll be a general discussion section at the end, but also we'll try and pick up any burning questions that you have on very specific points to do with people's individual presentations. So we'll pick that as we go along. I'm going to start by turning the clock back to 2019, before all this COVID-19 madness started. In that year, two organisations, the Dart Centre and the Film and Television Charity, both finalised research projects looking at the mental health of filmmakers in the UK. Okay. Now, don't worry about it being too UK-centric. There are a lot of UK people on this panel, but actually the lessons from their research, we're pretty certain, are likely to be applicable to people all over the world, working in lots of different settings. The FTC research was looking broadly at the whole kind of film and entertainment industry, which includes as a subset documentary makers. The Dart Centre research was focused much more narrowly on factual TV and looking at a very specific thing. So not the mental health of folk generally, but occupational distress. And by that, we mean, what is it in the work itself that can cause distress, that can generate particularly trauma, of course, and how do folk managing that in the industry, and how well is it recognised that there are issues around that? I'll talk about that a little bit later, but let's start with a clip from a short animation that captures some of the voices present in the Film and Television Charity's work.
And I've been in the industry nearly 40 years. There's a freedom in our job and a creativity that I don't know many people who just get to see so many different things.
I love the opportunity to work closely with people who are warm and thoughtful and empathetic and adventurous.
I feel incredibly privileged to be in this world. The fact you get to tell stories, to meet really interesting people, to go to amazing places, but also within that industry, there are certain pressures that can push you to the edge.
So I'd moved from Scotland to come to London with a partner. I was working quite a lot of late shifts, so we were ships in the night, didn't really see each other very much, and we ended up breaking up, and that's someone who I felt that there was a much bigger future there. Striking the right balance can be really difficult sometimes.
Now I've got young children, I do wonder whether there's a place for me. It affects your mental health because you're not valued. And it's not just women, it's men as well.
The thing I've found most difficult working in TV and struggling with mental health issues is the fact that as a freelancer, you have to maintain this pristine exterior. You can't be seen to have anything wrong with you so that, it may affect your employability.
If you're feeling anxious, vulnerable, depressed, these are still seen as signs of weakness in the film industry. And therefore, when you feel them, it's very, very hard to disclose to anybody what's going on. Film is this really strange thing where we look for moments of vulnerability and emotional openness on screen, but the culture that builds it is absolutely the reverse.
So that final thought is a pretty arresting thought, isn't it? So part of what it involves to make a film is to create a space in which our contributors can express their vulnerability. But to what extent as an industry do we create space for acknowledging the impact of the work we do on ourselves? So I'm going to give you a quick intro into the Dart Centre research. The clip we've seen, I think, is a fantastic, I'll just share my screen. The clip you've seen is a kind of fantastic introduction into the kind of general context of what we're talking about around kind of mental health issues. So for those of you who don't know what the Dart Centre does, is we're very focused on issues around working with trauma. We've been doing this for now 20 years. And basically we're an alliance of journalists and filmmakers and also mental health experts who believe that the best way of improving content is to have a discussion where we acknowledge and understand the emotional challenges. That's both in terms of improving the quality of filmmaking and journalism, but also making for kind of healthier working conditions for everybody involved. So our research was looking at occupational distress. It was funded by Wellcome and involved in-depth interviews with journalists, with filmmakers, and producers kind of working on UK TV generally. I really encourage you to read it. It's quite a thick volume, but there's lots of recommendations and ideas in it. And generally, I also recommend you to bookmark our site because you'll probably find on that things that might be useful about particular topics or dramatic issues. So I'll put that resource out there at the head. What we discovered in our research was something that should have been kind of blindingly obvious. We were originally tasked with exploring a whole range of stresses that could affect filmmakers, things like bullying, harassment, direct exposures to trauma, what happens if people are in situations where they see somebody dying, all this kind of thing. That was the original remit of the research. And what we discovered is that one of the prime drivers of distress is handling the distress of contributors. So although we originally intending to look primarily at the mental health of filmmakers, we ended up looking actually at the, what it takes to protect and safeguard contributors because of the level of concern there is in the industry about doing that. But also that that's something that's kind of rarely spoken about. So I don't want to go into too much detail because it'll take time. But some quick headlines in the research. Filmmakers in all genres are exposed to trauma. 100% of producers we talked to reported something that we're calling ethical distress. And that's the personal impact from not being entirely sure how to deal with or process the distress of their contributors and the kind of moral dilemmas that would raise. Junior producers were fearful of bringing up ethical concerns to their bosses because they thought it could impact their careers. Massive difference in different organizations. So ones that had a very open atmosphere, people felt more empowered to do that, but very often that didn't exist. And there's virtually no appropriate training on working with trauma-affected contributors or dealing with, or kind of promoting people's self-care when exposed to trauma. That's shifting now. There are programs for, kind of staff welfare, and there are various initiatives for freelancers out there that all kind of aim to promote resilience. Also interestingly, there was no agreed standards for psychological assessment. So people might employ psychologists to come in and psych test contributors to try and work out if those contributors are robust enough to appear on television. But there was no agreed standard about how this works. Some companies did it very thoughtfully. Other companies were basically outsourcing responsibility to other people. And also no agreed standards about what kinds of psychologists. So there's a lot in that. I'm going to stop my sharing now. Great. So the reason I put that out there very quickly is to kind of focus on key issues. There are massive challenges facing the industry. Issues around diversity, there's response to Me Too, there's this economic dislocation from COVID, there's the whole general question of economic exploitation. And all of these come into our discussion in some place. But what we're hoping to do today is to focus primarily on this relationship between contributors and staff and ask the simple question is how can we do better for both? So, David, I believe you've been working on one of the most daunting projects I can think about, an investigation to suicide. I think you have a clip. Can you take us on that?
Yes.
I'm not scared of death, if that's what you're thinking now. Come on, man, I think it's suicide. Do you think I'm scared to die? No, I'm not scared.
Each minute across the world, one man takes his own life. But what is it really like to want to kill yourself?
It's like someone constantly saying, you're a piece of shit, you're low, you'd be better off dead.
I just keep thinking how I'm still here. It baffles me. I thought it would have worked the first time.
Do you want to show the tabbies what I've got?
I just want to die. I just want to die, literally. Put me out of this life I've got. I didn't want this life.
1 out of every 6 men who make an attempt to kill themselves try again within a year.
You've got other entities trying to persuade you, do it. I hear it every day. Kill yourself. Kill yourself.
6 men, 6 lives, 20 suicide attempts between them.
Do you have any medication here with you, Leo? Anything?
First you take that. I don't want to harm myself with this.
Showing feelings and being emotional felt like weakness to me, so I didn't want to talk about it. You look vulnerable then. You know, if you're open about how you're feeling.
When I get down like that I actually want to kill myself. I actually just feel like there's nothing out here for me no more. So
you know that doesn't actually resolve anything though. You're just dead. You're just gone.
Now, for these men, those feelings are back. And this is the story of the hours, days, and weeks of their suicidal episode.
Like, I know it's painful to die, but can I just fall asleep and not wake up? Like, by a click of the fingers, I could be gone.
Hi. So, David, how did you set about trying to create some kind of structure of safety around that kind of project? Tell us a bit about how you approach that.
You do have to build in a lot of scaffolding around a project like that. In many ways, you're quite fortunate because we're working with a unit within the NHS. So we can call on a lot of specialists to help us put the right processes in place. They know the cast because we're casting from their pool of patients. So they can help us to select people they feel will not only tell us a story, but it's safe for them to do so. But there's always a big element of risk because we're dealing with suicidal men. We're working with a major broadcaster, so obviously there's a lot of processes and protocols that we put in place. But the key thing we had was time. We had time to meet other men who had come out of the other side of this process, who would be able to tell us about what it was like, what the experience actually feels like. We had a lot of time where the director could just go into the unit without a camera for a month or so and just shadow the practitioners to see what the work was like, and therefore be able to prepare herself when she's in the moment. Because it doesn't matter how many sort of procedural processes, and as I said before, scaffolding you put in place. In the end, you've got a filmmaker and their assistants having to choreograph themselves around a moment where somebody might want to end their own life. And how to be prepared to cope with that in the moment was something we realized that was really, really important. So let me give you an example. I do remember getting a call at about 2 a.m. one evening, and the director rang me up and I said, so what's going on? She said, well, I'm a bit stuck at the moment because this character, he's been sobbing for about 3 hours. And I went, right, and? She said, I'm just still not feeling that it's the right moment to leave because he's erected a noose upstairs in his house. And he's saying if I leave, that's what he's going to do. And I said, have you rung his care worker? And she said, absolutely. And I said, what did care worker say? And care worker said, well, he's attempted 5 or 6 times. I think the risk is pretty, you know, there is a risk, but he probably won't do it. He just needs the attention. So how do you navigate yourself through that kind of scenario? And to be honest, luckily, because we'd spent so long talking to so many men, so many of the people who work there, we'd shadowed them, we'd spoken to all the other interested groups and charities, that we realised, or she realised, she said, I'm going to give this another 45 minutes and I'm just going to keep following the instruction of just trying to calm him down, let him understand what the boundaries are, that I'm just here to follow him, to film him, and that I can get hold of his friends, family, or call an ambulance, but that's as far as I can go. And it was still really worrying, but after an hour she left. And after an hour she left. And he was okay, but it was tough for me, and I was removed miles away here in my house. So it was extra tough for them and him in that moment, making the program.
Absolutely. I mean, but this is a stunning illustration of actually something that's a more generalized problem, isn't it? It's the line of what responsibility do I have as a filmmaker, or maybe, you know, as a junior AP in a situation, never been exposed to this before. And often what I hear is a kind of tendency to feel that one should be as good as the psychiatric social worker, or somewhere able to cope with everything and make everything better. So what do you say to people?
That's a really good point, because there's something, I mean, I've been saying this thing for years, and I remember saying it to both of them that evening. I said, you are not his psych. Remember everything that we've talked about and all of those meetings we've had and all of the preparation we've done for this. And you just got to follow that process, and then you do have to leave, as tough as that is. You know, it was a very difficult film to make, because you can imagine it. They followed 12 men during a suicidal episode in a unit where 90% of the people they treat attempt suicide, and many are successful. So those are really very difficult decisions to make for one of the people on the team who's fairly inexperienced. So we also had to give them like a weekly support, so they had a psych each, which they had to see for some time to help them process everything they were dealing with.
Okay, so had supervision. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of aftercare responsibilities for contributors on this project? How's that work?
On this project, I mean, it was unlike ones that I'd done before in many ways. We had to, because often when you make a film, the director, and I think this is changing, but often the director is left to carry the baby, i.e. they have to keep this really tight relationship with the contributors that they've made a film for. And that can build up to loads and loads of people for years and years and years and years. That's a lot of pressure. In this case, we had a formalised process. So during the film, we had an exit plan for the director and the AP. They had to start talking to their contributors about their exit, their role, and how long it would, and what that looks like. So the contributors knew this wasn't necessarily a lifelong relationship, and it would gradually fade away. Then we had like a check-in system where after filming, they would check in with each contributor once a week, and that gradually over time went to once a fortnight, once a month, and I think now we're at about 8 months now where it's the sort of final report time. So we're at the last telephone checking in phase of that process. So it starts as like a weekly meeting or catch up or coffee, whatever, that gradually is turned into a phone call, and we're right at the end of it now, which is formalised. It's not flexible, it's all scheduled. And that's how we've sort of handled that part. And so far, I mean, I spoke to a director yesterday, you know, and we roughly know what 11 out of the 12 men are up to, where they are, and it feels manageable. Not all of them are still with the service either, you know, they're out in the world doing their own thing. So at the moment, it feels sensible and manageable.
So the key there is that you've got a lot of preparation and a lot of structure and a lot of time, and also, to be fair, a lot of resources. So I imagine there are lots of filmmakers out there from around the world who are listening to this with a strong feeling of kind of envy and thinking, but you know, I have an urgent topic that needs to be covered. It demands to be covered. I don't have anything like those resources or structure. So now I'd like to turn to Alyx, who's been working in the Philippines as an independent filmmaker. She has a film in the festival, as I've already said, that's been documenting Duterte's so-called war on drugs. Alyx, can you tell us a little bit more about your project? And I think you have a clip that you want to show. Standard warning, it does contain some distressing images, so if you can place yourself out there. And another thing, please, if you have questions, do put them in the question Q&A bucket. We would really like to kind of make this as interactive as possible. Great. So Alyx.
Yeah, I think we can play the clip first.
Okay.
Kasi may tropa ko pa po namatay, bali ba na po siya. Kasi po ay naampo tropa ko sa isang mundo.
Siya lang mag-isang tropa mo sa mundo?
Opo. Dalawa lang po tropa sa mundo eh.
Wala kang ibang tropa? Si Kian lang?
Opo. Dalawa po eh. Ay, tatlo po. Tatlo po.
Mabait pa si Kian?
Opo. Yan lang po tropa ko, tsaka si...
Tinutulungan ka ni Kian dati?
Opo.
Ano ginagawa niya?
Opo. Hindi niya na po tinutulungan. Kasi tayo ko na po sarili ko.
Pero binibigyan ka niya ng konting pagkain o pinapatulog ka niya dyan?
Hindi niya po pinapatulog dyan.
Pero mas matanda si Kian sa'yo, di ba?
Opo. Marang naging kuya ko na nga po yun eh. So, kaibigan po kami, tagal na po eh. Nahuli po si Mama. Ano po? Mga po. Nandito po nga po si Mama, ano po eh. Yung po, sa sinusunod ko. Tapos may family na kinapera. Kasi mga bayan na sa 15, ganun po. Tapos yung nag-aakakit pa ako siya mga po nag-alaga. Ay, paano yung dati? Na okay lang po sa kulungan. Addictive po.
Sigurado ka ba?
Nahuli nga po si Mama, yak po ako nangiyak eh. Sabi nila, subukan mo saktan yan. Sabi ni Mama, tapos pupukuhin ko ito ng baril sa ulo. Wag.
Bakit kalaban yung tawag mo sa ano?
Kasi po, baby ko lang po ako siya, sabi tayo ni Mama. Yung mga pulis tayo mo kalaban. Pag minsan po, tayong nagtatakbuhan na, ayos na ako.
Okay, so Alyx, can you tell us a little bit about the context of that clip? And you had to make various choices about who to choose to film and why this boy became a key character in your film.
Yeah, I chose this clip particularly because I think the greatest consequence of Duterte's war against drugs is really on children. You know, there's an entire generation of children who were killed, orphaned, or just really like this boy forced to grow up very fast. I realized that one of the things that I found most challenging was witnessing children you know, in very distressful situations, very traumatic situations. I had been following a boy whose leg got shot and also saw his father die. I was following him for a long time, but then I realized that I was not equipped to deal with traumatized children. I personally also had a hard time even just filming it or witnessing children grieving. And then I met this boy in this funeral. I realized you know, that I could actually tell this story through, you know, more nuanced situations. You will see in the film that they're just playing, a bunch of kids, but you know, they call the police the enemy, or how casually they talk about killings and drugs and death because this is really their environment. Yeah, like all the people in the film, I did not meet this kid through an NGO or a group. He had already been in social services, in and out, but yeah, they just had a hard time dealing with him.
Right. Yeah. No,
yeah.
cool.
Aswang is like, yeah, you would see, if you've seen the film, it's a very violent film. There's a lot of extreme scenes and images. Although I would have to say that we took a lot of significant restraint in editing, even at that point. We left out a lot of important elements in this boy's life and personality, precisely because we didn't want to put him in trouble, like, you know, ratting about the police or telling about the police, making him an informant. So the editors just decided to keep this innocent layer. You know, his worldview is just at play. Is just a little boy in the streets waiting for his mother to come out of prison. And I think this was my biggest consideration all throughout the film. I had to, and this is also a difficult thing to think about all the time for the last 3 years, you know, thinking about the safety of the people in the film, as well as the crew, including myself, that live in the Philippines. This occupied me a lot, actually, because this is an ongoing situation. I think it's even worse now. Impunity is much greater. And all these editorial choices are, you know, literally, I'm not even, yeah, it's just life and death. It's for myself, the production, the people in the film, and the people we decided to leave out. You know, everyone would face consequences if I wasn't careful or if I was being too brave.
It's a very, it sounds, it sounds a very lonely, in some ways, a very lonely place. Trauma inherently isolates. So you have everybody impacted by the events around them. It's the fabric of the situation in your society at the moment. In some ways, trauma. So we can't obviously ignore it at all. I think you have another clip that tells us a little bit about how you dealt with the isolation and built a kind of protective structure in this kind of, you know, let's face it, kind of crazy environment.
Yes, can we play clip 2?
Ilan po ba sila nung namatay?
3 at may isa po nakauwi. Ngayon yung isa nawawala hanggang ngayon hindi pa nakikita. Kaya yung sinasabi nilang mag-isa lang ang anak ko na nagmotor na hindi naman marunong magmotor. Napaka-imposible talaga.
Ano matay siya na may dalang motor?
Oo, yun po ang ibinibintang nila. Hindi porket binigyan sila ng ibig sabihin nito, binigyan sila ni Duterte ng ganyan na posisyon na, sige patayin nyo, sasamantalahin naman ng iba, di ba? Dahil alam nila hindi na masyadong issue. Sila rin. Gusto nila baka isang araw ang pulis, ang tingin lahat ng tao, mamamatay tao na. Gusto ba nila yung ganun? Paano naman yung mga ibang pulis na hindi ganun? Di ba po?
Nakipagtinamaan pa niya ang Innova ng pulis.
Innova, grabe po, di ba? Diyos ko, ganyang kalaki, kaya sobra na.
Mag-isa lang siya sa motor.
Opo.
Yung motor, walang relasyon sa inyo?
Wala po. Sabi ko nga pa nga, nagkaroon bigla yung motor yung anak ko, o pwede ko nang kunin. Pero yung wala namang motor yung anak ko, bigla nagkaroon ng motor.
Ilang araw niyo po siya inano?
4 na araw na. Okay. Ngayon, 21 niya, nagtatrabaho ako dyan. May pumunta dyan ng barangay tanod sa amin. Huwag kang mabibigla, namatay na yung anak mo. Ayan po siya. Yan po nagpapatunay na napakagaling po ng anak ko. Sa isang iglap, ganyan lang nila pinatay yung anak ko. Ayan siya. Ayan po siya, ang gwapo niya. Ayan po siya. Ayan. Ni kurot, hindi ko makurot yung anak ko. Ni palo, hindi ko mapalo yan. Kasi isang araw ganyan makikita mo yung anak ko. Sobra pong sakit. Sana po, ustisya po para sa anak ko. Bilang galang na lang po sa pagkamatay ng anak ko. Ayan po. Anak, makakamit mo yung ustisya na. Tandaan mo yan, anak. Paglalaban ka ni Mama, kahit ikabaril ko na yung paglaban ko sa'yo. Hindi lang nila alam ba gaano kasagit araw-araw. Kaya nagtatrabaho po ako para makalimutan ko ng konti yung ano niya. Kasi sobrang sakit talaga.
Okay, so you're together with a group of human rights activists and various people documenting these very distressing scenes. Right at the beginning, there's a face of a man who's taking notes, who looks extremely calm and thoughtful. And when we talked about this, you said that he was actually one of the pivotal figures in how you thought about looking after yourself working on this. If you could say a little bit about that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, the process of making Aswang was going out every night for a long time. It's basically following a trail of bodies. I met this man on the night shift. His name is Brother June. So he's a missionary priest, but he's also a freelance photojournalist when he wants it. And eventually he managed to channel the church's funds to bury the dead because there was thousands and people couldn't afford it. During those night shifts, and here it was during the day, Brother June and I, along with a lot of other photojournalists, fixers, writers, it became some sort of an unofficial group. This is why you keep hearing camera clicks in the film all throughout, because I was always filming with these people. In fact, there's a Nat Geo film called The Nightcrawlers, and this was this group, and the name started as a joke, but yeah, it somehow stuck. I'm describing this because I didn't approach or have access to a counselor or psychologist at the time. This isn't very common in the Philippines and probably in most areas, most countries. Here, maybe it exists more for photojournalists occasionally, but not, I've never heard about filmmakers, for instance. At the time, I was so very deep in the story that I also didn't think about this. I sort of just pushed it at the back of my head. But this group became many things for me. Became a layer of protection because it's hard to film at night as a woman. Source of information, and I think most importantly, it became a sounding board, because these people understood exactly what I was going through. And for the most part, they had the same motivations as myself. And by that, I mean, it wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't about getting a scoop, because it's impossible not to empathize these victims. The first impulse seems to be always to help. That's what we had in common. You were right. I felt very alone, especially in the first year of making this documentary. I think it's pretty common for documentary filmmakers. But this group gave me a lot of comfort, helped me somehow keep my sanity, and it kept me accountable. Even after I finished the film, like I would never put something on screen that they would also deem questionable. But when Brother June came into the scene, the dynamics really changed, because it really started going from just filming or documenting to, really helping and documenting in the hopes that someday there would be accountability, some sort of reckoning. His presence also meant that our access was easier because the Philippines is mostly Catholic. So people were very open to him. And also he's a priest. He spent his life in service of the marginalized sector, so he's more equipped to deal with situations like this, to talk to people like this emotionally, mentally. And for me as well, I took a lot of cues from this guy.
Great. So what I'm hearing here is the importance of shaping a support community, but also a community of kind of ethical concern and kind of understanding of the content and understanding of the situation. As we talk a lot about the need for mentoring as well in filmmaking, to have like kind of strong figures who can discuss experience, explain how they do things, like in terms of being very talented or experienced at dealing with other people's distress. So thanks so much for that. I'm now going to go on to our next speaker, and that's Rachel, who has a kind of a rich panoply of information about the state of play, more generally about mental health in filmmaking. And she's going to take us somewhere. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. So at the Film and TV Charity, we're here to support the people working behind the scenes in film and television. And so through our work and through our support line, we were hearing stories every day of people working in film and TV and really struggling dealing with challenging content, challenging conditions, feeling stress at work. And that wasn't just people that were working in what we can really see, people working in news and documentary, very obviously working in very challenging conditions, but also people working across drama and entertainment and sports and post-production. And we just thought, you know, what's going on here? So we wanted to move beyond the stories and really uncover the data. So last year we commissioned the Work Foundation to undertake a major piece of research for us to understand the state of mental health across the UK's film and TV industry. And that research kind of had 3 phases. There was an evidence review of what we already knew. There was lots of interviews and consultations, but the centerpiece of it was a survey that went out to everybody in the industry. And we got over 9,000 responses to that survey, which I think for us was the first time that we realized, gosh, you know, there's really something going on here, because surveys are notoriously difficult to get people to fill in. And, you know, and we in 3 weeks got nearly 9,400 people filling in our survey, and over 1,500 of them filling in, you know, after having done a good 10 minutes of filling in questions, telling us their stories in a free text box at the end. And I'm going to take you through that research. And just to warn you, I mean, the picture was pretty grim. I'm just going to share my screen.
Good.
Can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, as you probably saw in the film right at the beginning, but among film and TV workers, 87% had experienced a mental health issue. We benched that against kind of national surveys, and that compares with 65% in the wider economy. Workers were twice as likely to report having experienced anxiety compared with the national average. But most concerning was what we heard about self-harm and suicide, with you know, workers in film and TV more than 3 times as likely to have self-harmed. That was 1 in 4 workers. More than half had considered taking their own life, and that compared with 1/5 nationally. And shockingly, 1 in 10 had actually taken steps to end their life. So, you know, these results were worse than even we thought they may be. They're obviously alarming and hugely galvanizing. And our research partners, the Work Foundation, said, you know, with these stats, they could unequivocally say there was a mental health crisis in our industry. But the research was also looking at what might be the underlying causes of that crisis. We didn't want to just understand the state, we wanted to understand what sat beneath that and what we might be able to do about it. And we identified these kind of 3 areas of concern, which we call the kind of 3 C's, the conditions, the culture, and the capability in our industry. And just to kind of quickly summarize them, the conditions, and I think, you know, this particularly is about the work intensity of working in our industry. 1 in 8 workers had worked over 60 hours in the previous week. We asked them, you know, a snapshot, what did you do last week? And 1 in 8 worked over 60 hours, which actually compares in the wider economy to 1 in 50. So you can see that people are working those really long hours. But equally, 1 in 8 had not worked at all in the previous week. So there is this really up and down nature of working incredibly intensively and then having no work at all that I think can be very difficult for people to manage with their work-life balance. And again, I think it said in the film, but 78% reported that they struggled with work-life balance compared to 27% in other industries. So really huge margins there. And it kind of made sense, but again, 1 in 10 scored the maximum in terms of loneliness for standard loneliness scores. So I think people feeling they can't manage their work-life balance and they feel lonely and isolated. And you can imagine with the kind of added conditions of working on traumatic content or with vulnerable contributors, there really is a concern with some of the conditions in our industry. And then the second area was culture, and this is really about the prevailing norms and behavior in our culture. And, you know, bullying and harassment was highly reported. 84% of workers had experienced or witnessed bullying. And there was a real perceived lack of accountability around this, that it was kind of very much normalized. And there was this kind of culture of toughness where I think, you know, people say almost quite proudly, oh, you have to be tough to work in this industry, and you wear that toughness as a badge of honor. I've made it through. You know, I'm tough, I can do it. But kind of coming alongside that was a sense of powerlessness, I think, of kind of not being able to do anything about that toughness, that you kind of have to put up with it. And there, in the free text responses, I mean, something that was really striking is the words that were used most often to describe people's situation was disposable and expendable. So this idea that you kind of have to put up with the status quo because there's someone coming up behind you who'll take on those extra hours, who'll work in that way, who'll do that difficult thing. And I think that, you know, is really troubling. And, you know, kind of given that there was obviously a real kind of stigma and a reluctance to disclose mental health issues within our industry. So only 7% said that if they had a mental health issue, they would approach a manager, someone they were working with, about that. And then finally, capability, which is kind of given the conditions, given the culture, you know, what is the ability of our industry to support its workforce? And I think, again, then we found that there was a real lack of employer support. So for those that did have a mental health issue, if they discussed it with their manager or employer, only 28% said it improved the situation, and actually 5% said it made it worse. There were real barriers to getting professional support, and I think the two key barriers were worried about being judged and also a lack of time, so just not being able to take the time out to kind of attend that appointment. And also a real kind of lack of training and support, and, you know, particularly around challenging content and contributors. So only 16% felt there was enough support for those working on traumatic stories, and only 14% felt there was enough support when working with vulnerable contributors. And then we can kind of break the data down to just look at people that work in factual and documentary. And I think in line with the research that Gavin talked about from the Dart Centre, you know, our research highlighted that exposure to distressing content can have a real impact on mental well-being, and actually that this impacts people right through the sort of value chain of production, so through production, through post-production. And actually we had individuals who work in research who were reporting kind of really extensive and prolonged exposure to traumatizing content that was having a real impact on them. So our survey found that people working in faction documentary had the highest incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, 25%, compared with an average of 16% across the survey sample. And interview respondents kind of talked about experiencing vivid nightmares, of kind of a sense of numbness. There was quite a lot reported about this idea that colleagues might kind of talk about their quite distressing experiences in quite a light-hearted way, and that made it quite hard to process what people had been through, that because it was normalized, people sort of laughed and joked about what was going on, or talked about it in a kind of easy way and didn't actually acknowledge how difficult it was. And also there was a real sense of a delay in response sometimes, so people not realizing how impacted they'd been by what they'd witnessed or seen, and actually that impact coming kind of down the line and really hitting them hard. And it's worth noting that kind of filmmakers in this genre were much more likely to consider leaving the industry due to concerns for their mental well-being, so 71% compared to 63%. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Whole Picture programme, which is our programme for change, because this session really is about how can we do better. And our research, part of that was really trying to understand the causes so that we could tackle those causes, and we are working with the industry to really bring a programme together with 7 strands that addresses the capability, the culture and the conditions. And I think those 3 are kind of interrelated and mutually reinforcing, and those, you know, we have to make sure that our responses are interrelated and mutually reinforcing, and that we look at, you know, obviously we need to look at support, and that's a key part of increasing support to individuals, but we also really want to look at prevention, at tackling those conditions, at tackling that culture. And finally, I just wanted to, you know, for the people watching, kind of talk about the kind of 5 tangible things that we want to see coming out of this programme. So it's a big programme of activity. It's going to run over 2 years. But for those people actually currently working, you know, what will you see? What will be there to try and support you going forward? We're going to work with the industry to develop some production standards. So that's really a kind of blueprint for creating what we're calling mentally healthy productions, co-designed with the industry and at every level of the production chain. We're going to pilot those, we're going to develop them, we're going to iterate them, and really get a set of best practice that people can take forward on productions that risk assesses the mental health of, you know, the risk on a production. We're going to develop anti-bullying resources, a bullying advisor to be added to our support line, introducing a digital platform for recording incidents of bullying. And I think, again, it's just worth saying on that in terms of bullying, we felt very much that, you know, there are those very high profile occasions that you hear about that really have gone over the line. I think there's an awful lot of these sorts of micro-bullying behaviours, and what we want is for people just to be able to record that, to support themselves through that. There'll be a behaviour change campaign that will really tackle some of those behaviours in the industry from the very top of the industry down. We're working on an enhanced training package, both in mental health training, but also on training to support people with those underlying conditions. And finally, really offering more support to freelancers. And we think it's really important that there's that professional support there, but also the importance of peer networks, which I think others have talked about, and developing a kind of peer framework for people to give each other advice, which was, you know, repeatedly reported to us. People that have developed really good peer networks found the benefit of that kind of every day in the work that they do.
Rachel, thanks so much for that. That's a really, really helpful kind of grounding in some of the next steps that need to happen. I'd like to turn now to, if you could press stop share.
Will do.
Yeah, great, thank you. Brilliant. And if Sasha, you could turn on your video, because you're now in the hot seat. You've seen this from many different angles. You've seen this as, well, you've seen this as initially as a AP, and then as a producer, and then as a director of your own company, and then as a commissioner at Channel 4. So I think you got some thoughts. We've heard a lot of thoughts already. Where would you like to take us?
I'd like to just acknowledge up front, you did at the beginning of the session, but I just think it's really important to say how difficult it is right now. I just think that a lot of people have been suffering in this time of COVID, and I know there's been lots of discussions and lots of groups, and it feels like it's a febrile moment. It feels like it's a real, there is a, the stresses and strains right now are particularly tough on the industry, and Rachel's brilliant work was done before COVID, and I think it's really critical to acknowledge just how much people are going through it right now. And in terms of, you know, I'd like to talk a little bit about bad practice, which I think sadly is still going on in various different parts, and also good practice, and what is coming, and change that is absolutely recognised by broadcasters now needed, and it does feel like a really important moment right now, and I think we are on the cusp of some quite significant change. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? We've got Alyx on the one side, who is just, you know, out there as a lone filmmaker, needing to get support systems in place and doing it in a brilliant way, but on the fly as she's going. And it's just massively, you know, there's a huge spectrum here that we're talking about, from that kind of situation through to super indies and broadcasters who really need to have their shop in good order and need good practices in place. And I think but it's really important to recognise that there's a lot of different scope along the way. I feel in documentaries that the critical thing is something that David brought up is about, you know, we generally, not always, but we generally got time, and time is such a precious resource, and I always feel that the good safeguarded productions put in heavily early, and it's about that sort of period of really reflection early on. Training is such a massively important part of and all the high risk things that we do. We always go through trauma training and support right at the top, and, you know, in the way that if you're going into those difficult situations like David and Alyx have been, to know about it, but to be prepared in yourself and to have that kind that support on hand, and to know what your individual support.
So Sasha, how does that trauma training kind of prepare people? What do they get out of it?
Well, it helps identify. It really is. I mean, it's interesting how people feel that you know, when people talk about risk assessments years ago, it was, oh God, so boring. But actually, there is a way in which this is really just aggrandizing that whole process and really going through the what ifs. How are we going to do? Because you sort of know what's coming. You know, if you're going to deal with people in suicidal situations, you're going to face those phone calls that David is talking about, and that situation which sounded horrific for that poor director in that situation. So the more preparation that you can do and go through those scenarios, what will happen when this goes on? And there's a variety, we'll talk about this later on, if it's a hope, is that there's a variety of different support mechanisms out there. But to think through these things and knowing that, right, well, we're likely to feel stress, we're likely to be confronted, we're likely to be dealing with very vulnerable people. What are they going to be facing? How are we going to talk to them? How are we going to share information about what this process is, you know, because we know what filmmaking is, of course, but most people don't understand the process. And even if they think they know what being in a film means, actually it's very different, particularly long term. And what's appropriate at what point of the process? You know, often I feel that, yes, people are going into the public domain and they will get a reaction to a film, but if a film takes 1.5 years to make, you probably don't want to be talking about in great detail what it's going to be like to be in the public domain at the beginning of that process, because you've got many different hurdles along the way to overcome first. And so working out what's appropriate at each stage and also repeating these things, you know, communication is just so massively important, is it, that amongst our own teams, regularly, formally and informally checking in and supporting each other, but also with contributors. And that reinforcement of that process, it just gets, the more information we can share, I think it's better. It's a really win-win process because you'll get better films out of it. That's the irony of it all, is that the more you put in, the more you get out. And it's a you know, and if the bar gets higher and higher, doesn't it? But commissioners want more and more and more. Where can we get to? You know, where can we get to? And I don't think people would have been making the kinds of films that Alyx and David have been putting forward 10, 20 years ago. But now we're kind of like, right, what areas are left that we can delve into? And if we are doing that, that's a greater responsibility on the teams to take on that in a responsible way. And by that I don't mean, and I think it's really important to say that when I'm talking about that, that's not just the filmmaking teams themselves, that's the broadcasters, you know, that's the kind of, is it done in a way which is responsible? We've been talking a lot in Channel 4 about really expanding the startup meetings. So once something's commissioned, is that not just getting the executive producer down, but getting the whole team sat down and having a really proper conversation and really identifying where are the risk points here, not in a kind of boring way, but what, you know, if we're going into a difficult situation, let's talk about that. Let's go through that. What's going to be done? That just helps everyone. You know, I know from speaking to David separately that he budgeted for aftercare, for example. Really good process, really good, important thing to be doing, because how otherwise are people going to, you know, we don't want to do that as a goodwill and good favour from PDs who care. That's not reasonable, is it? And broadcasters and independents should respect that, you know.
So the idea, So the idea is that the duty of care exists like all the way down the chain, and it's important that no part of that chain feels isolated or unable to ask advice either way up it.
Exactly. And one thing I would really stress as well, and it's a cultural change which is happening, and I know there's been a lot of reticence from freelancers, but I would appeal to freelancers to believe there's changes going on, is that idea of being terrified to speak out. If I share my thoughts about bad practice, that is just I'm never gonna work again. Of course, that is I've been in that situation myself. I know I've witnessed bad practice and probably not spoken up in the right way. you know, I do want to highlight Channel 4. We're doing a thing at the moment called the Speak Up, which has been there since time began, but hasn't been used in the right way, which is a completely anonymous way to phone in and say, I'm not happy with this. And that has gone through a kind of reassessment process in the last few months, where everything is going to be taken straight up to Kelly Webb-Lamb, who's, you know, Deputy Director of Programs, and will be treated in a kind of A, respectful, B, sort of anonymous way, which is really fair to the person involved. And we want to hear that stuff, you know, we actively want to hear that stuff. We're not going to change. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And, you know, from a broadcasting point of view, where I sit now, we'll do our bit. But I would really ask, and it's a big ask, I know, is that for people to feel empowered to speak out, because change has got to happen with all of us.
Okay, I think what we need to do now is there's some comments coming in, questions coming into the Q&A bucket. And if you feel inspired, you've got a question to ask, please put it in. We've got at least 15 minutes to have a general discussion in which we take on board some of those points as a group. And maybe a little bit longer. Let's see how we go with that. So first of all, Sasha's just been talking about the importance of open dialogue, support within productions, but I can see from a number of comments that are out there that so far people haven't found that to be the case. So we can think of things that, you know, initiatives at the top. Sasha's described a few, but more generally, what does it take, do you think, to create a culture in which people feel confident to reach out and talk to others about the challenges they're experiencing when working on distressing subject matters? So David, how do you see that?
Well, I'm quite lucky because I've been in those big companies before I set up proper content, where it was very hierarchical, and it felt, if you're at the bottom, I think it feels very difficult to talk to people at the top. There isn't open dialogue, there's a lot of pressure, there's lots of lines of communication, and you've got that old adage. I remember when I came into TV, there was that adage of, you're only as good as your last job. So you button everything up and you try and present yourself and try and be perfect, which is changing now. I'm lucky we're a small company, and yes, there's a hierarchy, but you try and make everybody approachable, warm. I sort of appoint people to look after people. So junior members have someone just on their level or just above who they can use for like peer support. So somehow, some way, I get to hear everything, even if I don't hear it from the guy at the very, very bottom. So I can check in how everybody is. And I've got an example of that. This is very difficult, this lockdown, particularly on the younger members. It's on everyone, but we've found it in our company, particularly on the young members of the team. And so I spoke to one of our producers, and she told me about a couple of the members and what they're going through at the moment. And we were able to try and help them and give them some structure and give them stuff to do and try and help them out of the situation they're in. So we've done it is just appoint key people on each level who they can talk to, who's approachable, accessible, and gets past those sort of vulnerable feelings about what do people think of me.
Yeah, just a quick pick up on that one. I think it's really, really important actually. So in our work with, you know, filmmakers, journalists, lots of different people at this particular moment, what we're finding is that because of COVID, that people need to extra effort in finding responsible ways of communicating with people. Because when you can't see people's faces and everything's very distant and you're not sure if something's going to happen, this grows this space for paranoia. You know, maybe my boss doesn't like me kind of thing. And so even just very simple stuff like praising good work, you know, congratulating people, it's just touching base is so important. So Alyx, what are your thoughts? What works in your world?
Yeah, this is why the film was done independently, precisely because there were key things that would have been easier if it was for the broadcaster. But I felt I decided eventually to go the other way. So yeah, that's why this was like, it's done completely through grants. Yeah, I didn't really have this much of a problem while making Aswang.
Yeah, but what you did was interesting because it's a different thing than David's talking about, is that you grew your own support group. So there's a responsibility on the level perhaps of managers and leaders to think about support within their organizations. But then Sophie Duncan, I think, has raised this issue, it's come up in the Q&A questions, is how do we create a more generalized culture of peer support? So with the best will in the world, there are going to be times in which people aren't going to want to talk to their bosses. So how do we get filmmakers working together and reaching out across different silos? Rachel, maybe this is...
I think, I think it will take time, because I think, as Sasha was almost saying, I think conditions do change, but it takes longer for that culture to break down, for that kind of fear of disclosing to go away. And I think it really is a combination of reducing that stigma. I mean, as I said, nearly 9 in 10 people in our industry have had a mental health issue, and yet people don't want to say that they've had a mental health issue. And if even just getting that message out there, you're in the majority, you're not in the minority, I think is helpful for people to feel able to disclose. But I also really think it's a capacity issue. I think, if somebody that you're working with breaks their leg, everybody knows how to deal with that. Like, okay, they can't work this period of time. This is what we do. This is what I say to them. Maybe send them a basket of fruit at home. I don't know. Everyone kind of understands that situation and feels confident with it. If somebody approaches you to talk about their mental health issue, I think people feel less comfortable talking about that. They don't know how to support that person, and they feel difficult. And I think that's the problem. It's getting people to feel more able to have those conversations.
So Sasha, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say it's really difficult if it's a crisis immediately, isn't it? And the thing I would be encouraging you to talk about is when people join as freelancers, or that's just a question straight up as you join. It's like, so what's your policy on distress or mental health if people, and that should be seen in a really constructive light. There are some really interesting and inspiring things that are going on. So I don't know if you've heard about Lime, the independent production company, drama people, and they've just introduced this inclusivity program, which is kind of really drilling down into a really positive support network within their company, and they've sort of made that public. There's an article about it in Broadcast at the moment, but it's a sort of that sort of leading light way is a really good thing for people to look at and follow. But I just think that if there's a way of doing it in the normal setting before it becomes the crisis, at the start of productions is the obvious point, is just to be raised as a matter of course. One thing I'd love to see personally done is that on ed-spec forms, which are the sort of legal forms which we start productions with, that there's just a little box about mental well-being, and then as a matter of course is discussed on each production in each way. It may not be suitable, but what Rachel's findings have shown is that it's not just those really extreme programs like David and Alyx are talking about. It can be a really normal everyday show, and something innocuous can trigger a contributor, and the other way around, a contributor can trigger a member of the production team. And so actually this is, the sooner we can get to that point where this is just every day, because it clearly is, all of our findings have shown that, the better.
Yeah. I think I should say something very quickly, because it'd be crazy not to mention it, is in the issue of support, is that the Dart Centre runs retreats. We can't afford to run that many, unfortunately, but we've been building a network of kind of concerned filmmakers and journalists, which, if that's how I met Sasha, of course. So that's how we met through that process. And the key for it to work well is it's not just talking about personal impact. It's very much sharing information, tips, and insight into the craft issues. Like, how do you interview a vulnerable person in a way that puts more ground under their feet rather than taking it away? So how do we think about the interview as a kind of collaborative process? And also basic trauma awareness. What are we dealing with? What am I likely to feel if I'm interviewing somebody? what are they likely to be going through? So not just saying, using the word vulnerability, but exploring what that kind of vulnerability is a kind of like a really important thing, is to think about those things. Quick question for you, Rachel. What's happening with the task forces?
So
They're up and running.
Have I?
Somebody's asking, yeah.
It's up and running, but you know, and I think we are delighted to have support from people right across the industry. You know, BBC, Channel 4, Endemol, ITV. So we've got Sky are involved, but as I wanted to say, it's not finalised. There's plenty of room for more people to join, and this really is an industry-wide movement. So we have the people on our task force sort of championing this programme, giving a commitment in terms of a commitment to change, but also a commitment in terms of a commitment to fund this work as well, which I think is really important. But alongside that, there is a whole process through this programme in which we want to work right across the industry, because this won't be successful unless we work with the industry to kind of co-design, to learn, to share ideas. So it really is a process that we're going through to kind of come up with these solutions and make them work and make them stick. Right.
So I don't want to necessarily unpack the whole thing because it's really long, but there's also the whole question people are raising about 0-hour contracts, short contracts. And what we know about trauma is that when people reach crunch points with trauma, it's often not the traumatic stresses themselves that lead to it, but it's the general conditions around it. So the straw that breaks the camel's back is often things to do with employment conditions. And so it's a big thing. We haven't got time to talk about it. But any on the panel have kind of thoughts about, particularly about fairer deal for supporting freelancers?
I do think it's a big issue, and I think that also the fast turnaround productions that get commissioned on a Friday and then need to be in production on Monday, you know, they are challenging. And I do feel that, you know, those broader startup meetings and so are a good way to protect in terms of 0-hour contracts, so that everyone is involved in those conversations early on in terms of what is this. I can think of some good examples of very fast turnaround films, but they've been done in a way which is where people are working long hours under stressful conditions, but it's been with a shared understanding and a respectfulness and a kind of way that has been done with time off at the end in a way that, you know, there is, you know, I do feel that there's a nature of various times of just the way that things are. We're never going to get down to everyone putting their things down after 8 hours. It's just not the industry. It's awful to say, and so I do think there's a part of it that we have to adapt to working conditions. I think that working, you know, ridiculously long hours without breaks is very dangerous, and we have to be careful about that. So I think as with all of these things, it's about understanding at the beginning, you know, if you're going to take, you know, obviously people need to survive, and so it's sort of very difficult to reject work, but at the same time, an open discussion at the beginning of a contract is a really important thing. It's a really important thing, and it's to be exploring what the boundaries are of that. What will you be expecting of me under these circumstances, you know, during this time? How are you? And if it's not being kept to for that, then there's a recourse. Where it becomes difficult is if those conversations aren't had, then it's hard, isn't it? So
yeah, I guess the other thing about that, which is a really, really important general point for everybody, is that there's a whole thing about psychological preparedness. And there are times in our life when we're going to feel really resilient and able to take on like a big challenge. And then other times, then actually we probably want something a bit smaller. So for instance, you know, somebody's just worked on a film about atrocities in Iraq. That might not be the best time to work on the next film about bombing in Syria or something. So trying to kind of pace oneself and realistically checking in. I mean, if somebody feels like 100% up for it, but it's good to feel that one has the right to check in with oneself and to assess one's preparedness before beginning a big project. And obviously, from a position of distance, that's obviously a good idea, because you're more likely to do a better job if you're in a better condition, and you're more likely to work more effectively with contributors if you turn up in a good emotional state. But somehow this idea that we've always got to take work, whatever it is, can also get us into all kinds of trouble and shorten careers, I guess, rather than lengthen them. Yeah. So Alyx, do you have a thought? I mean, I think one thing we're coming to a close. We've got lots of comments, really good comments that have come up. Somebody has mentioned how important mental first aid training was for them, partly because it meant they could recognise when something got too much for a contributor and a contributor had a panic attack. So that's an interesting question we need to think about, is what level of skills do people need to know? Albeit they're not going to be therapists, they're not going to, we're not in a position as filmmakers to save people, but there is stuff we can do to help stabilise a situation and also to foresee it. You know, when is a certain question likely to be the wrong one? When you shouldn't ask that overly emotional question. All of that kind of stuff has come up. Also, people are very impressed about the idea of planning and how important it is to foresee problems before they begin. What I wanted to do, though, just to come to a close, because we are running out of time, is just very quickly ask everybody what they do on a personal level to switch off the work, get that protective space and look after themselves out of the context of work. So let's start with David, because he's smiling and looking at the wall.
Well, I've got two things. I've got a family, right, which takes off a lot of my time.
Yeah.
And I am, I'm afraid, a football obsessive. And I will literally lose myself in fandom, actually regularly throughout the day, let alone during a project. I'm one of those lucky people who find it quite easy to switch off from work. I've been doing it a long time, and I can literally switch off. I can take my dog for a walk for 2-3 hours and I'm gone.
Okay, so that's a muscle. It's an active muscle we need to develop, the switching off muscle.
I think you do. I think you do. Some people need to find a pastime, but for me, I've always found it quite easy to say, all right, I've finished now. Especially since we've been working at home, I found it really easy to define, okay, I'm going to do an hour now, and then I'm going to go and do something else. I can do that. Great. So, yeah.
Okay, so Rachel, what's your top tip in terms of getting the work out of your head?
Well, again, I mean, I've got a family and they often demand that the work comes out of your head, but actually that's another demand in itself. So I think, you know, when I'm taking time for myself, I think I love to walk, and I often just go out for a walk in an evening, especially since the lockdown, kind of just, sometimes I find I've been on my computer all day, and I think that's really unhealthy. And so often it's quite late in the evening, but I just make sure I go for that walk. And whenever I can, I try and go a bit further afield and actually go somewhere like the Lake District, where you can really just, you know, do that walking. And I just find that very good for clearing your head.
Great, thank you. Alyx?
Yeah, what I did was really went on a lot of holidays. I found it was important to physically take yourself out. I live in the city in Manila, so I had to get myself out there and really just force myself not to think about it, because I'm quite obsessive with work. It's all I think about for a long time. So yeah, holidays were great.
Okay, recharge so you can re-enter. Yeah, makes absolute sense. Sasha?
Yeah, pretty much covered already. But physical things, basically. So kind of echo what Rachel says, we just sat down for 7-8 hours at a computer, just to get up and do something very different. So jump on a bike, go for a walk, play a game of tennis, whatever it might be, but just something that's kind of not sat down. And then I totally agree with Alyx. I love that thing in it. I wish I could have more holidays, but the moment that you could actually just properly go and not be on email and not you know, leave the work phone, that's the joyous, that's the best space. And reading a book, oh my God, to read a novel, you know, that's the height of luxury.
So personally for me, I think a lot of us spend too much time in our heads. It's and too much time looking at screens. Yeah, kind of sucked into the images, which are very arresting. So I think anything really that gets one's kind of body alive and helps one look after physical health is like a really, really important part of resilience. I think we're drawing to a close. So I'd like to thank, first of all our audience. We can't see you, but we know you're there. And it's really been encouraging to see all the comments coming through in the chat and in the Q&A, and lots of interest. And also a wonderful panel who've really, really helped, I think, to set some kind of key markers and to open up a very important discussion that has to be an ongoing discussion. And so with everybody who's in this Sheffield DocFest part of Zoomlandia together, I really urge everyone to continue talking and to take the discussion into other pockets of Zoomland and heaven knows, maybe even into the real world as well. So that we're actually doing stuff about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.